And we've also got Martin Lauber ready to go alongside him as away they go then. Race 2, the feature race for our historics. And
really bumpy coming up the hill here in turn 2. That's one of the worst areas of the track.
Good start, good clean start, and a lovely sand. I know on the hillside there, they're enjoying the sights and sounds of classic Formula One. I wish it sounded like that today. I think we should take these to Vegas and throw the others out.
Plenty of oil down there. It's quite tricky, especially in a single-seater, an open cockpit. You get a bit more of the kitty litter in your eyes.
Yeah.
And that's something that you really have to pay attention to, especially on the first lap on cold, slick tyres.
I still haven't found out who the culprit is, but he did a darn good job of laying down as much oil as he possibly could on the racing line, but they've done a good job. But that's why we had the delay. Yardley McLaren had a Tonka toy of that as well, or a Matchbox car of that as well.
That's a car with a great history. I believe that's Danny Baker at the wheel. I was chatting with him a bit earlier, and that's Jody Scheckter and Peter Revson's
car, yeah.
That is the car that was responsible under Jody Schecter's usage of the big accident at Silverstone in 1973 at the start line. And so I was chatting with Danny earlier. That car's been dormant for a few years, and it's great to see it back out on the circuit, and Danny peddling it very well as always.
Yeah, and back in the early 70s, when I first sort of got into Formula One, I didn't know anything about the manufacturers, Scott. It was all about the Yardley McLaren and the JPS Lotus, and little did I know that these were perfumes and cigarettes. But that's how I knew these cars.
Yeah, and they were, and that really was their goal, right? They were meant to be rolling billboards, and that's where the funding came from. Certainly, I don't think many of us had any beta tools, but yet, they were on the front of a lot of the cars.
The March that's out there at the moment. Yep.
Yeah, but Bud looks like he's pulling out a pretty commanding lead here. It's going to be pretty tough to make that up.
So what's your, obviously you know the drivers, but is there a particular car? We've mentioned that 312, obviously the Ferrari storied history, Niki Lauda, etc., is out there in the pack.
Yeah, he's going to be a little bit further back.
Chris McAllister at the wheel, yeah.
One of the disadvantages of the Ferrari, as beautiful as it is and as glorious as it sounds, these DFE engines now are making more power than they ever made in period.
Right.
And they're also as reliable as a refrigerator for the most part. The Ferrari has not enjoyed 30 years of continuous development like the DFVs have. So it's pretty tough sledding to run up a Ferrari with a legal engine against the DFV-powered car these days.
I actually think for poor old Jim Farley and Ford, they've got a bit of a heritage to live up to when they come back with an engine in Formula One.
They do. The DFV was such a landmark accomplishment because anybody with a checkbook could go Formula One racing.
Right.
They'd hire a designer, they'd get a couple fabricators, they'd make a chassis, they'd buy a DFV, they'd buy a Hewland, and they'd put a car together. Not anymore. But still great time in the history of the sport.
So the Tyrrell coming side by side and getting up a position, nicely done.
Yeah, I think Martin Lauber is struggling with his car. The Tyrrell is a ground effect car, but if you look at Martin's line through the corner and the speed he's carrying, it's a lot different than it was yesterday.
And that Penske is in some ways a bit of a rarity because Penske obviously didn't have a huge history in Formula One, but they made a name for themselves and they did go racing in Formula One, 1975, this particular PC4.
Yeah, the Penskes were modified Marches. They bought tubs from Marches. By the time they got to the PC4, Penske was largely constructing the cars on their own, but that's how they did it. This is going to be kind of tough for Martin because I know the two drivers involved here, Martin and Dwight Matheson. And Martin's still going to have a lot of corner speed on Dwight, but he's not going to be able to get around him because Dwight's driving a ground effect car.
And hats off to Zach Brown. He doesn't care about branding. He is the CEO of McLaren, but why not race a Williams, especially a World Championship winning Alan Jones from Australia. I know his son pretty well. He raced in Asia for a long time. Christian did the Carrera Cup, won that. And got to know Alan during that time, which was great because he had nothing better to do than give his son a hard time. And he's a typical Oz, is Alan. And he told us some great stories of those times. And, of course, it was a heady time also for Williams themselves. Well, Scott's got to go, I don't know, race a car or something. So, that, we'll let him go and bring in Mike Miller again. But, these names trickle off. Niki Lauda, Alan Jones, Keke Rosberg. I mean, we're very fortunate to have these cars.
Absolutely. It was such a golden era, too. I mean, we have a couple eras at play right now, but these drivers and what they accomplished in a time where a lot of drivers were, frankly, getting hurt, getting injured. I mean, Niki Lauda's story. We talked about it a little bit yesterday, where I turned on the television, Niki Lauda finished on the podium, and I'm expecting this prince to get out of the car, and he had just gotten burned. And I'm
in
like,
a similar car to the one we're looking at.
In a very similar car to what we're watching right now. So in spite of that, I chose racing as my profession. I guess my dad didn't advise me well, or I'm not sure, but it's just an interesting era with the drivers and what they were risking and how hard they had to push. And you can watch these guys right now. I mean, they're sliding. That's one thing I alluded to with the Trans Am race. These tires are so much more fun to drive than a current racing tire. They're not quite as fast, but they're just so much more fun to drive because the car's moving around the whole time. And there's Steve Romack coming up through the field. He had a flat tire. He rolled over something on the way to grid yesterday, and so that's why his result yesterday was not what we were anticipating, but it's fun to watch him come through the field right now. He's been racing so long. When I was a kid and coming up, cutting my teeth through the Atlantic Series, he was a guy in the Atlantic Series that was on the podium quite often, so he's definitely a great driver.
Now, you've driven some of these cars, Horatio alongside you, so I've got great to have two historic race car drivers here. But what always amazes me, and it's great to watch these cars being driven hard, but it takes some skill. There's no ifs and buts about it. These are the original cars. It's not like they're replicas. So you've got to be both gentle, but also aggressive, because these cars don't go slowly. They don't react well if you're going slowly, right?
That's absolutely right. I mean, at the end of the day, in period, they never thought of them as cars that in 50 years we want to preserve them. So it's a mixture of, do you drive them the way they were driven in period, or do you take them around gently? And with a slicks and wing car, especially like one of these, the faster you drive, the easier it becomes.
Yeah.
An old adage that my father was taught when he had his first McLaren Formula 5000 car: if you go into a corner at 120 miles an hour and it understeers, you need to go in at 130. And it just becomes so much easier to drive the harder you push them. And that's a bit of a difficult thing to convince yourself of.
Yeah, that's a mind meld, isn't it?
That's right.
It's that commitment level, right? I've driven, we were talking to the 82 Williams, the tunnel car, and you're looking at the corner, and visually you're like, that's probably a 100-mile-an-hour corner. And you're like, no, it's way more than that. And the commitment level, and like you said, if you underdrive it, you have way less grip. It's almost easier to go in faster. That's where the 15-inch wheel on the Williams, I think, was an engineering marvel. What they tried to do is take some of the sidewall flex out, actually made the car more stiff to drive, which kept the platform more level, and they were hoping to create more grip.
Talking about a classic, doesn't get any better than this. The 77 from Lotus, an absolutely fantastic car, and of course, Chris Locke doffing the cap to the great Mario Andretti with the lid. And I've been very lucky. I came to Laguna and was commentating on Mario Andretti's dream of taking out a modern Formula One car, which he was allowed to do, and it was such a pleasure. And even at his age, he was still pushing it hard, as only Mario can do. Drive it like Andretti, as they say, and that's exactly what he did. That
was fun to watch. If you remember, it wasn't that long ago, he would actually at the 500 take the cars out.
Yeah, that's right.
And test them at the 500 to help them with setup. And here's Mario Andretti, who, when was the first 500 he drove? Was it in the 70s?
Something like that. Yeah, absolutely.
And he's still out there whipping the wheel. That was quite fun to watch.
Yeah, he still does the two-seaters now and again, too. I saw him at Nashville last year. I just passed him, and I'm like, morning, Mario. And it's like, you kind of walk away going, that really was Mario Andretti. In fact, I had a lovely chat with him, and Mario could have summed up the racing in the 70s. All these Formula One drivers and all these IndyCar drivers were complaining. This is at Nashville last year. All these IndyCar drivers were complaining about how bumpy this street circuit is. And Mario just got on the microphone and he turned to him and he goes, I don't know what they're all talking about. It's bumpy. Drive around the bumps. It's the same for everybody. Get on with it. And at that point, all bets are off. That's it. Mario has spoken, the Pope of motor racing. But, I mean, it's a fair point.
I think the difference, that tells you a lot about the difference between today's drivers and the drivers back then. Can you imagine, as we look at the 3-1-2 here, you imagine no one would stand up to, for example, Enzo Ferrari. Niki Lauda was the first man that really came along and stood up to Enzo Ferrari and told him that the cars were actually terrible to drive. And they managed to develop one. So the difference today, can you imagine a driver coming along, one of the modern guys, and with essentially not really a big Formula One CV of results, not a world champion. If he came along today and said, car is awful, they would swap him for someone so quickly. So it tells you a lot. The old school style of racing, they were much different to today's generation of Formula One drivers.
Another good story, Niki Lauda, of course, in that movie that's been made about the battle between he and James Hunt back in the day, and really well done, I thought.
Agreed.
In terms of how they put it together. But a great story is, I was interviewing Mario at Coda for one of his events, and he said, I don't like that movie at all. And I said, why not? He said, I won the darn race. Nobody mentioned me in the whole darn film. Good point. Sorry, Mario. We forgot about you.
Mario's such a character. He's such a nice, modest guy, too. Like, anybody can walk up to him and get an autograph. He's a very humble man.
A brilliant guy. Last year, I think I ran into him with my father, and it's so incredible. Some of the people you meet at the Velocity Invitational that you just can actually go up and chat to.
Absolutely.
Some heroes when I was a kid. Chaps such as I was just chatting with Derek Bell, and it's just so many incredible people
slipped
here.
in and slipped out. How dare the great one do such a thing?
That's right.
Launched a car yesterday, did Derek.
Look at that gorgeous Vittorio Brambilla car.
Yes.
That, for me, that's one of the most significant cars. So one of the first books when I was about 5 years old, my father gave me was Niki Lauda and the Grand Prix Gladiators.
He was earmarking you for racing immediately then.
It was brilliant showing up to school at 5 years old with that, and the teacher having a read through it thinking, well, if this is what you want to read. So this era of racing car and the Formula One cars, it's incredible to see that 312T of Chris McAllister's. My father had the 312 steering wheel, one of the originals from Niki Lauda's cars, that unfortunately I had to sell to start racing, but it was a good compromise to actually get started myself.
That's not a bad deal though. Sell a steering wheel, get a car.
That's
I like
right.
that.
That works out okay. Yeah, it worked out. So Romac's up to third, and he's really closing in on Lauber, and they're both in flat-bottom cars. So Romac's on the comeback here. This is going to be a fun battle to watch.
Flat-bottom cars, you make the rocking wheel go around. No, that's not the lyrics. Something else.
Well, they don't. Again, the flat-bottom cars don't have such a disadvantage on this track. So until it gets resurfaced and the grip comes back up, the flat-bottom cars, it's more of an even playing field.
Now, if you weren't with us yesterday, Bud Mola won the race in that Williams, and he's on his way to do the same. But I think Martin Lauber and Steve Romack might have some words to say in these last 2 laps. You're listening to Horatio Fitzsimon, who's had a great weekend here as a driver, young 23-year-old, taking 2 historics. And all I could say to all the fathers out there, for God's sake, give them a golf club or a tennis racket. It's a lot cheaper.
I've been taking my kids to the golf course, and they really like driving the golf carts. And for me, I'm encouraging that. But look at this battle.
This is great. Oh, now where would you overtake here, Horatio?
Wherever there is a gap, quite honestly.
Well, there isn't one.
Well, I think when you're following, obviously, much closer in these slicks and wings cars, you suffer a bit with the understeer the closer you get. So really it depends. I think around a circuit like Sonoma, it's so bumpy and undulating.
Yeah.
It's quite difficult. You really have to set up coming out of the corner, especially if you're in a car that's a momentum car, which is more of what my background is with the Lotus. You want to really focus on your exit speed and setting up and getting to the inside into the following corner.
Well, we were marveling at the way you were taking on those Ferraris, because you definitely had the measure of them, and it was the tactics that you were putting on the car itself, because it wasn't outright speed that you wanted on.
No, that's right. That's right. You've got to really build up the car. You have to wind it up and keep the power in. With the 250 LM, that car is stunning, mid-engine V12, and the grunt in a straight line is incredible in comparison to that Elan. But where our weak points are is really down the straights. Coming into the corners, you can carry a lot more speed. So it's just keeping that minimum speed up all the time.
Well, Bud Mola has been around a long time in historic racing, but he's having a cracking weekend in that Williams. He is channeling his inner Keke, his inner Nico.
Yeah, he's taking the edge off. He's like, I just need to see the checkered flag. Meanwhile, Romac's on a charge, so he better not slow down too much.
No, Romac's up to 2nd place now in that march, so luckily he's got this final lap to come out of the corner, and he does take the checkered flag and win in the Williams here at Sonoma. The number 61, and fastest lap goes to Romack. No surprise there. A 1:32.6 by Stephen in that march. Martin Lauber will cross the line in the Penske in 3rd position, and Dwight Matherson, it looks as though it's going to take that Tyrrell 09 009 to 4th position ahead of Zach Brown in 5th.
What a fun race to watch. That was just incredible. Those cars around this track, amazing.
A lot of fun. A lot of fun indeed. Well, and a lot of fun having you guys to talk us around. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Very much.
Appreciate being here.
Are you done for the day? Are you done for the weekend?
Well, I hope not. Hopefully I'll get out in a Mini later
Oh,
on,
good deal.
which would be great to see.
No, that I'll wait to see.
That's another giant killer of a car.
Which
so-
one are you in?
I don't know yet. I'm hoping to get in a car.
I reckon
nothing
you
firm
could.
yet.
I'd start wandering around and start bidding on it,
I
saying,
have
"Listen,
been,
I'm the
yeah.
guy that one in the green and gold car. What do you got?"
Yeah, well, absolutely. I'm going to have to go wander around now and see if we can get out in another car.
Good to have you over here, Mike. Thank you again, as always.
Thank you.
You're always welcome.